probably going to talk to you sidewise so I can be close to the microphone and be able to see one of the two screens here. As mentioned, I'm a landscape fire ecologist, and I've spent 30 years researching the original role of fire across the landscape of North America. I'm going to talk about the topic here about South Florida. I'm also going to range far beyond that across the country and also look at the big picture of climate change and mass extinction that we're facing and show that despite the horror of what that involves, there are going to be unusual new opportunities for funding for natural resources that the tribes hopefully can position themselves to get in on. This is a quote from Ed Komarick from one of the Tall Timbers Fire Ecology conferences. Ed, after a number of years of pioneering work, was pronounced at one of the conferences the father of landscape fire, the father of fire ecology. He was getting quite old at the time, and he burst into tears at that recognition, but it was extremely well deserved. As soon as there was fuel, there was fire. And fire has been on terrestrial landscapes since the beginning of vegetation. Plants are fuel. And 430 million years ago, in the Devonian period, the first land plants evolved, coming up from freshwater habitats. And what makes a land plant is xylem and phloem, both of those cell types evolved. That is the principal component of wood. As soon as you had that, there was fire because lightning was abundant in the original landscape. We know that from fossil fire scars on trees preserved from that period, from fulgurites, which are little branching structures in sand where lightning hits sand and fuses the sand grains. That there is abundant charcoal and chunks of charred wood from that period. We're going to jump ahead 429.9 million years to North America and the population, the first population of the Western Hemisphere. Original people in multiple waves apparently crossed the Bering Strait, settled the New World. New dates are as early as 15,000 years ago. There are sites that have been dated that old in Pennsylvania and Virginia, and sites that seem to be even older than that in South America. So that picture is still unfolding, the antiquity of people on the land here. 1492, Columbus comes along. The Western Hemisphere, long settled and widely settled, ranging from small villages along every stream to vast civilizations in the Mississippi Valley, Central America, and now there is new research using LIDAR, ground-penetrating radar, side-looking radar, that is showing the existence of large cities in the Amazon. What we thought was a primeval jungle was inhabited when the first settlers came. First settlers from Europe, I should say. 1500s, European explorers come with old world diseases. Early visits before even De Soto, who was the first that really brought diseases on a massive scale. So the 500 years is an accurate figure for what we're talking about since the first Europeans came here. Tens of millions of people died. We're still getting new concepts of that, especially given the size of native populations in South America. All of this is an unfolding message. De Soto came in 1540 through Florida, contacting the original Timucuans who are now extinct from the diseases that were introduced. At the same time, Coronado was coming up from Mexico the same year, and amazingly, these two large groups of soldiers and explorers came within 300 miles of each other on either side of the Mississippi River and didn't know the other was there, but they left a wake of destruction with the introduction of diseases along the way. 1540 to 1830, Europeans established very quickly saturation populations of exotic livestock on open range, mostly 5 or 6 species: cattle, sheep, horses, mules, goats, things that on this lush range that was here quickly multiplied exponentially until they were actually saturated, all the land. all of those animals that could be supported were being supported. This is an entirely different story, a different talk that we don't have time to go into, but that was the first major impact on fire frequency. 1720s, pressured by Europeans, the Seminole and Miccosukee occupied southern Florida, reoccupying the former lands of the exterminated original peoples that were there and have been there ever since. 1700 Seminoles continued their traditional uses for fire, and those go back now probably 15,000 years is what we're talking about for land management. And those practices were copied by the European cattlemen, and they quickly learned that cattle gravitated toward recently burned areas. They will go and nibble on freshly toasted greens. They come back as soon as the lush new grass comes up. It's very much more nutritious than the unburned wiregrass and other species. 1860 to 1880, the Deep South by then was still a pastoral economy. It was maintained by frequent burning, both lightning and human sources, with livestock saturated on open range. 1890s to the present, we had the strange mission of the federal government to stamp out one of the most important natural processes on the landscape, which was fire. The Seminole and the white cattlemen defied the national anti-fire bureaucracy and continued to burn because it made sense. They had lived with it for ages. 1960s, the Tall Timbers Fire Conferences began, beginning in 1960, and it made the case for fire as a vital natural force. That was really picked up in Florida before the rest of the country. And by 1983, there were, that year, 4.6 million acres were prescribed burned in the state of Florida. In Florida, restoring fire also means restoring hydrology. With the Seminole War of 1836, where the Seminoles and the landscape combined defeated the U.S. Army, the Army lost from 1,000 to 4,000 troops. They spent $30 to $50 million to try and either capture or kill the remaining Seminoles. And that was a huge boondoggle. And they learned a lesson from that, one of which was we got to do something about all this wet land that we can't get around in. And that was effort, that the thought of doing that was paused until about 1881, when private developers started to try and drain Florida to convert it into agricultural land. So going back and repairing some of the damage done from that, they tried to cut off the flow of water to the Everglades, tried to drain them, and reversing that as part of restoring natural integrity to the land. Restoring fire is the other half of that. This is a prescribed burn north of here in Brevard County in a natural pond cypress palmetto community. And the more I see fire across the country, I just think of burning out the understory is good housekeeping. I know it was that for the Native Americans. You maintain the land, you keep the understory open for all of the species of birds, plants, and animals that need those habitats. For those of you from the West, this is what South Florida looks like in large part. This is in the Everglades. The little white line at the bottom is the Big Cypress National Preserve. I looked at this aerial photo and I could identify at least 20 different kinds of vegetation, all wet, a very different fire landscape than the Westerners are used to. You try and drive a fire plow in here anywhere, it's going to sink out of sight. It requires different kinds of equipment, such as the strange-looking swamp buggy for fire management, high flotation equipment. Restoring hydrology and restoring natural fire equals ecological integrity in South Florida. Historically, there were no beaver, and still aren't, in South Florida. You first reached those in the peninsula, the panhandle area of Florida to the north, and then across the country, where beaver maintained hydrology by themselves. There were an estimated, thousands of beaver in every state along each stream system, maintaining these strings of beaver ecosystems, beaver ponds, shallow water areas, beaver marshes, and then swamp forest or something like that. Then the next beaver pond, deep water, shallow water, beaver marsh forest, and so on, down these just continuous strings. It's been estimated that beaver created and maintained wetlands equal to almost the entirety of the Great Lakes across the country of the U.S. And that had been going on for 50 million years. Beaver as a genus are that old. Here in the South Florida, drainage, as I just mentioned, was by ditching and draining, and that has to be repaired in areas that we're going to consider truly natural. We'll look a little at the role of fire in maintaining species diversity of plants. This is a map of the Great Plains grassland, short grass, medium, middle grass, and tall grass. And this covers all or parts of 15 states and provinces, a just vast area from Canada to Mexico. This is a list of the major sort of keystone species of the prairie region, starting at the top with big blue stems, 2 species in all of the Great Plains, 19 species of big blue stems in Florida. Indian grasses, 1 species in the Great Plains, 4 species in the Southeast. Little blue stems, 1 species in the Great Plains, 10 species in Florida. Florida is an ancient refuge for fire-dependent species. These genera arose hundreds of thousands or millions of years old, and they indicate fire frequency regimes that old. South Florida was also the center of resistance to the federal gospel of fire exclusion. And native tribes had 15,000 years of history with using fire to manage conditions on the land. The cattlemen learned from them and from watching their cattle after lightning fires. Burning made sense for renewing the nutritive value of otherwise tough, indigestible grasses like wiregrass. Florida has the highest number of lightning strikes and lightning-ignited fires in the country. Comeric made a map of the ignitions in 1 year in the 1960s. I think it was 66. There were 1,156 lightning ignitions in the state of Florida, and that was with many counties not even reporting data. Part of the reasons for the persistence of natural fire ecology in this portion of Florida is that it was far removed from any kind of effective federal firefighting efforts until recent decades, and the lack of specialized equipment that it takes to get around. And Florida, basically, the state, the people, and the environment said no thanks to Smokey Bear and his message from Washington. I'm going to talk now about the bigger picture of what we face in timber management and all natural resources management in the next few decades. This is something that I call the Great Triage. For the first time in the history of the planet, us, the smart monkeys, are in the process of dividing management of all terrestrial lands into 3 major categories. Domain 1 are true natural areas with the potential for maintaining all of our species diversity. Domain 2 are multifunctional or working landscapes, as the Conservancy, Nature Conservancy likes to call them. Domain 3 are the transformed lands, fully converted to meet human wants and needs. This is what Domain 3 looks like. The great metropolises, the large cities, medium-sized cities, small towns and hamlets, paved areas and parking lots. This is a place where nature plays very little role. Also, Domain 3 are standard row crop agriculture and intensive silviculture. So you see on the upper left, corn, a monoculture, 1 species basically. Below, soybeans. And wildlife biologists recently calculated that bobwhite chicks can get the protein they need from insects to survive in a soybean field if they simply forage for 27 hours a day. Also Domain 3 are these pine trees in rows. So that is all Domain 3. Domain 2 is the working landscapes or multifunctional landscapes. And this is the Nature Conservancy's Matador Ranch, 60,000 acres in east central Montana. And the Conservancy leases out all of this land to surrounding cattle ranchers. In exchange for easements, that promise to use best management practices for grazing, such as keeping cattle out of sensitive riparian areas. And this is great for domain 2, but the thing to remember about conservation on production lands is that in the west, you can see the intensity of grazing, you can see the grass stubble there. The amount of cattle that you can raise in order for a rancher to make a living is such that eventually 50% of all species of birds, plants, and animals can't live with that kind of continued intensity of cattle raising. This is only about 10 miles, as the crow flies, from the cattle photo you just saw across the Missouri River on the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, 1.2 million acres. And in this area, cattle had been excluded for 35 years. Fire had not been excluded. In fact, you see char on the trees. This has never been prescribed burned. This is in a lightning hotspot. Whenever you're downwind of a mountain range, you're likely to be in a lightning ignition hotspot. And that has maintained about a 10 to 12 year fire frequency here, which is very close to pre-European fire. You can see the lush grass foreblair that's there in the understory with very high species diversity. There are some 25,800 protected natural areas in the U.S. How many of those have any degree of fire integrity is anybody's guess. I have my own guess. That's something we should know, but we have been starved for personnel, for studies, for compiling this vital information for preservation of species, increasing budget cuts, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a similar area with full fire integrity. This is the coastal meadows. These occur from the panhandle of Florida across southern Alabama and Mississippi, near sea level, and a classic frequent fire community with trees is bilayered in structure. You see the tree trunks at the top. Those are about half longleaf pine and half slash. The longleaf is on the slightly convex areas. The slash is in the slightly concave areas or flat. And then in the foreground, you see the white-top pitcher plant there, a very fire-dependent species. When I took this photo 36 years ago, it had been burned about every 3 years. We're starting to see the lid come off of the discussion of climate change that has been imposed in this country for the last 12 years. Putting climate change in perspective, the socioeconomic perspective, which you will hear from the Nature Conservancy and others, is that climate change changes everything. Species are going to move, communities are going to be different, so what we do doesn't matter a lot. From the perspective of a fire planet, however, a species that requires a 3 to 5 year fire interval today will still require that interval 50, 100, 300 years into climate change. Climate change changes nothing in the fundamentals of fire ecology, and it's no excuse for not restoring natural fire. This picture that you see is a painting by a friend of mine, Philip Juris, of the original fire-maintained black belt prairies of Mississippi and Alabama. These are the landscapes that Native Americans lived in before settlement and before fire suppression. You can see how different, how open it is. One thing has become apparent to me is we need a new definition of fire-dependent species. In the past, a species had to have some evolutionary gimmick, such as serotinous cones, that required the heat of a passing fire to open the cones and shower seeds down onto the newly exposed mineral soil for germination. That is the tiniest tip of the iceberg, and I proposed this new definition at the Society for Conservation Biology meetings last year in Toronto. A fire-dependent species is any species that without fire ultimately will become rare or go extinct. And it turns out that thousands of the species in the southeastern U.S. Meet that criterion. It's a new way of looking at fire. It's not just plants. That picture of a bird in the lower right corner is Bachman's warbler. That species is extinct because its original habitat was canebrake, the 10 million acres of canebrake that occurred naturally in the southeastern U.S. and a few other brushy habitats. Without fire to maintain it, canebrake is now gone. It's a common species, but as a community type, it's rare, and the bird went with it. So if you told an ornithologist that Bachman's warbler was a fire-dependent species, you would get a blank stare, most likely. But it definitely is, because when you took fire out, the species went extinct. Another new definition we need is restoring fire integrity. And I'm going to read this definition. This will be in a Forest Service GTR that's coming out this year from meetings in Missoula. And fire integrity means fire moving freely in a landscape through seasons and years at its natural frequency, displaying its customary range of behaviors, constantly renewing vegetation, stabilizing soil chemistry, removing dead fuels, renewing the complex mosaic of habitats at all scales, and interacting with the dynamic equilibrium of predators and herbivores. And that is what has sustained in the past the full diversity of terrestrial species, from soil microorganisms up through arthropods, birds, plants, and animals for the last 400 million years. I'm going to make a prediction and show you the evidence for it. We are at the very beginning of a swing of the conservation funding pendulum into exponential natural resources funding to save the planet. The era of ideological funding cuts for all conservation agencies by a hostile Congress is coming to an end. Some of the evidence for that: the lid is coming off of 12 years of censorship. That is another talk in itself that I could tell you about. We don't have time. Of climate change. Recent evidence shows that global warming is happening twice as fast as expected. That's just out from the UN this year, from very recent data. The co-crisis of mass extinction of species is just now being brought to public view. The control of Congress by fossil fuel corporations and trillionaire corporate holding companies is starting to break down. There's too much pressure for that to be maintained. As of last month even, the British Parliament made a declaration. They're no longer talking about climate change, they're talking about the global climate crisis, because people are starting to die from climate change. May 6th, the UN IPCC, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, says that 1 million species are poised for extinction soon. That is a report that's not out yet. This was something leaked, but it's a 1,500-page report that will be coming out and hitting the news very soon. The economic model of unlimited exponential growth is breaking down, exponential exploitation of resources, and so on. This is a graph that shows what's happened to our funding for natural resources across the board in the country. In 1978, it reached a level of about 2.5% of the national budget. You can see what's happened since then, downhill ever since, and a bigger slide in recent years, and even more. This goes off of the graph. This ends at 2014. We have far less than 1% of the national budget. At the same time, the pressures and needs would have had this funding go up, increasing instead of decreasing, to where it should be about 4% of the national budget. And that is going to start to be rectified. Putting things in perspective, there's a little thumbnail of population growth from 10,000 BC up until Roman times, around 81. The Romans invented concrete and they invented steel, things that led to major changes and expansion of agriculture. Then if we come on up to about 1800, 1780 or so, we have the Industrial Revolution and expansion of agriculture in the New World. And you can see what happened to population in the 20th century. We have this spike. Any of you who have had a course in ecology or biology recognize this as a J-shaped population curve. In nature, this exponential curve always ends in a crash. We are being told on TV frequently that, well, we're humans. It's not going to happen to us because we're too smart. We'll see. This is the best science on population growth of the planet right now. New evidence has just come out, new compilations in the last 2 or 3 years that even modifies this. But here you have from 1950 up until the present time, the growth of population on the planet comes up here. And what you have is this red line showing the projection for 2100. And it's starting to level off according to this projection. Recently, and also the news, Fox News in particular, picked up on this and said, we don't need to worry, we can have business as usual because we're getting over the hump now. In reality, the most recent projection shows that this bend is not happening very much. The theory was that as third world countries became more prosperous, people would have fewer babies. It's not happening. But according to the latest evidence. So we are still in very hot water. One missing piece of information here, which I'm astonished at, was they left off 1942, down here at the bottom, Cecil Frost was born. And when I was born in the middle of World War II, there were only 2.3 billion people in the world. There was hardly anybody here. Then in my lifetime, it has doubled and tripled. And this is the projection in the next 36 years. We are going to hit this line right here, which represents 10 billion people on the planet. The amazing coincidence is that is adding 2.3 billion people to the planet in the next 36 years. That was the population of the entire Earth when I was born. Either I'm very, very old or we are in some very big trouble. This is the other crisis, and that is the sixth extinction. The fifth extinction was 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. That was an asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula. Its remains have been found buried beneath the surface. It killed all the dinosaurs. It killed every animal on Earth larger than a cat. It killed all the coral reefs because of acidification that occurred after that. Corals that we have today had to re-evolve from scratch, entirely new species. It took 15 million years for corals to start to reappear. And we're losing the coral reefs again to ocean acidification. This is a book, if you haven't read it, by Elizabeth Colbert. 2014, she had researched and compiled information from interviews with researchers around the world on climate change, species losses, all of the things that humans are doing to the planet in the name of economic growth. And she published this book. It won the Pulitzer Prize the next year. The study at the bottom, the graph, shows Ceballos, Paul Ehrlich, and others looking at 600 or many million years of evolution of vertebrates, all of the birds, fishes, reptiles, amphibians, and on mammals. And what you see is that we have data from the 1500s or 1600s when European ships were setting out from Portugal and Spain and England and France, bringing with them rats and mice and fleas and European diseases across the planet. And you see what has happened to species in that time. This is the disappearance, the departure from natural extinction rate of, for instance, 1900 to the present time, the natural extinction rate revealed over millions of years from paleontology is that we should have lost about 9 species of vertebrates on the planet. In reality, we've lost 438 species. And you can see this is starting to look like that J-shaped population curve of human doing. This is a crisis that's just now coming into public recognition. So we'll look at the role of fire in all of this. This is the NOAA ground flash data across the country for lightning strikes. You'll notice Florida is bright red. That represents 8 to 16 strikes per square kilometer per year, which is a real bombardment. And it leads to, in pre-European times, a very high fire frequency. I wish we had a map of fires related to Native Americans as an ignition source. It could probably be done by looking at population centers of Native Americans, but nobody has attempted it yet. This is my best shot at that. I published this in the Tall Timbers Conference proceedings in 1998, and this is a map of pre-European fire frequency regions of the U.S. The light color, the lightest color, represents 1 to 3 year fire intervals on mean, and that light color comes all the way along the Gulf Coastal Plain from Virginia to Texas. The increasingly darker colors are lower fire frequencies. So this attempts to combine the ignitions from both Native Americans and lightning and landscape effects, because landscape, once both of those are just ignition sources. Once you light a fire, how far it goes and fire frequency is determined by what the landscape does with fire and what the fuels do with fire, so that in the Great Plains you have areas where historically there are recorded fires from the Colorado Front Range that crossed all the way, burned across 2 states until they reached the Mississippi River and went out. So you would have a very high fire frequency in that case. Looking around, this is the King Fire, one of these catastrophic fires that we have now. It followed a 5-year drought. It moved this 15 miles in about 3 days from the ignition source. Not very particularly high winds. It was just very flammable and had been there fire suppressed for over 100 years. This is what the pyrocumulus cloud looked like from Lake Tahoe. You would have never have seen this in nature. Much of the El Dorado National Forest had ponderosa and Jeffrey pine that burned about every 7 years or so. It would have been savanna-like without a woody understory. And now these huge fires are getting torched. Climate change is being blamed for this. And climate change has greatly expanded the ignition window at both ends of fire season and increased intensity of fire. But climate change did not put those 100-year fuels on this site. These sorts of disasters are 95% human cause and about 5% climate change. This, you've seen photos like this. I took this picture after the Star Gulch fire in the Boise National Forest in '96. Every stem you see there is dead. You can see remnants of the fuel buildup of the continuous shrubby layer of tree stems underneath. Many of them burned away. I turned around and took a picture to the other side of the road at this very spot. The same wildfire burned this side, but it looked like this. The only difference is that this side had been prescribed burn to clear out the brush. Why hasn't this reached Congress? These messages have been sent to Congress, but they don't want to hear. Hopefully, the future with all of these crises, Congress is going to have to listen. This is back to the El Dorado. This was a wilderness area just south of the King Fire that didn't burn. This is what it looks like. Can you see any fuel here? The virgin forest here, this is federal wilderness, it's never been logged, was Douglas fir, Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine, those 2 species. The density of these virgin trees, you can see 2 in this photo. They're about 5 feet in diameter. Density was about 6 to 8 trees per acre, which was a savanna situation. At a 7-year fire interval, this would have had a continuous grass forb layer underneath, very open and beautiful. I walked around looking for a sprig of grass or a flowering plant of any kind, some distance, and could not find one. What you have is that deep litter and duff layer that you see, and you can bounce up and down on it. It's that springy, nothing but fuel. The underbrush, if you want to call it that, has stems up to 2 feet in diameter. A major task for restoration. The district ranger for the site has a plan for doing the restoration, but it takes money, and we have no money for this kind of work. There's no excuse, because we definitely have the money. It's just being diverted other places to the billionaires, if you want to be blunt about it. The future of restoration of these kind of forests, the district ranger there proposed, we have this structure that we use to set up incident commands for wildfires. We have type 1, 2, and 3, and 4 and 5. He suggests setting up experimentally a standing incident command team structure for type 3 incidents and use that for restoring these situations like this and move it from place to place as needed. Definitely something that's doable. Some of the best restored areas you can see in the country are on the reservations. This is the Flathead Reservation, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. And you notice they're very carefully burning, starting above and coming down slope to prevent things from getting out of hand. You can see the strips, here's 1, 2, and 3 being laid very closely together to keep tight control of the fire. The Salish and Kootenai are trying to restore all of the natural habitats on this huge huge reservation, the habitats that they can do this to, that are not being used for other things. And I talked to the head of the fire crew and said, you know, what's your goal, what's your reason for this? And he said, it's the will of the elders. And I was floored by that. And I got to thinking, where can we get some elders for the rest of the country? An amazing job that they're doing there. This is camas. This is one of the species they're burning for. This was a major winter food supply for Native Americans. And this is just a lush, moist meadow on the Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge up just south of Glacier National Park. The plant just thrives on frequent fire. This is a Napier woman preparing the winter supply of camas, and they would collect as many of these as they could and then dry them in camas ovens for winter food. This was done over a vast area of the landscape. This is last year in meetings in Missoula, Montana, the fire lab, we went out and looked, and they took us to this area, this moist flat that had been totally overgrown. And this is the kind of restoration they're doing, restoring ecological integrity to the land. You can see where they've cut the stumps of all of these small stems that had built up in the understory and burned a couple of times, and the camas is starting to respond strongly. So many species can still be brought back on the reservations and I realize many reservations are dependent on getting income for timber, but you can use fire for timber management, and you can use it for areas to restore really the natural food sources and materials that Native peoples used originally. This is a map I referred to. This is a more recent version by Rich Guyette, Mike Stambaugh, Dan Day, and others at the Missouri Tree Ring Lab, which is in Missouri right here at Columbia. And this is a model. And this model is based mostly on physical chemical properties, but also encompasses the huge network of fire scar chronologies we have across the country now, showing pre-European fire frequency. The take-home message from this, if you look at the light yellow-green area up near the Canadian border, down through the oranges and the reds to the peninsular Florida, that covers the fire frequency range from nearly annual to 12 to 14 years. The point of this is that the pre-European landscape of the United States was a frequent fire landscape. The cooler colors, the blues and purples, represent areas with lower fire frequencies. And of course, in this whole landscape that you see, all of these oranges and reds, there are many fire protected areas down in creeks, along creeks, ravines, and things like that, north slopes, where there were much lower fire frequencies found. It's more complex the more closely you look. A few of the species that are involved, and part of the threat, the major threat of extinction, is related to fire exclusion. Nobody has really looked at this in reality. This is a little plant called Harper's Beauty, this little yellow wildflower. 20 years ago, it occurred only in 2 counties in the panhandle of Florida, and the sites were wet mowed roadsides along Interstate 10. Obviously not its original habitat. This species might be extinct today except for the efforts of Joan Walker with the Forest Service, who opened up areas on the adjacent Apalachicola National Forest, cleared moist savanna, and let the sun in, and this plant is now thriving there. The other plant that you're seeing on the right-hand side, Harper's Beauty is one of several hundred species in the Southeast that are frequent fire obligates to the 1 to 3 or 4 year fire frequency range. The plant on the right, Georgia aster, is an obligate for 3 to 5 year fire frequency, and there are probably 2,000 to 3,000 species that need that frequency in the southeastern U.S. Today, most of our native flora in the Carolinas is relegated to roadsides and power line right-of-ways, such as you see here. I mentioned that I have for 30 years mapped original fire frequency. I do that by going back to the original land-grant maps for vegetation types, but I also look at vegetation on every soil series on a site, make species lists. In areas like this, and this was a former post oak savanna, now just a thicket of multi-story woody vegetation. And I have to go to the roadsides to compile the list of native plants of the original prairie species that were there below. Venus flytrap is a documented species that needs at least a 3-year fire frequency. If mean fire frequency drops below 3 years, it disappears. It's because it grows in wet habitats that are rapidly overgrown by more dominant grasses and shrubs. And you can see from this graph, we found in study plots the highest number of Venus flytrap, 12 per square meter, occurs in plots that were burned annually. You see that with a lot of other southeastern species. Then when mean frequency drops to 2, 3, and 4 years, the population just plunge. And if you maintain fire longer, intervals longer than 4 years, the species is lost. This is a bird relative obligate to that same fire regime. This is the Kissimmee Prairie grasshopper sparrow, a federal endangered species. It's actually a subspecies. And this is Florida dry prairie. And this area has one of the highest lightning fire densities known. The average frequency from lightning excuse me, runs 2.1 years. And this bird will not nest in any of this grassy habitat that hasn't been burned, at least in the preceding 2.5 years. What happens is each year it flies and finds a patch that was black the previous year and nests there. This, I said, was a federal endangered species, so more evidence of the need of that. I want to ask the question I've been asking myself for some time. Ecologists call fire a disturbance. They formed a field called disturbance ecology about 30 years ago when they realized that things change in nature other than just plant succession. This is looking at rain. Would you call rain a disturbance? It's usually the departure from the normal range of variation. If it's too dry, we call it a drought. If it's too much, we call it a flood, and we call that disturbance. So applying those same criteria to fire, is fire a disturbance? If you look at departure, fire deprivation is fire exclusion, and we're seeing thousands of species across the country threatened with extinction because of that. Fire excess is if you go in and burn an area in a naturally fire-sheltered portion of the landscape where fire shouldn't be there. But how about if you look at the normal range of fire frequency? I don't see how you can call that disturbance. Here's a case in point from my dissertation. The plot you see at the upper left is a beautiful longleaf pine savanna. Longleaf is the only tree, species-rich grassy understory. If you look in the distance, you see a little white speck one place, and that's a person standing in my study plot. I did this plot in 1984, and by coincidence, that year, this land in the Croatan National Forest was declared federal wilderness under the act called Rare 2. And by that declaration at that time, you could not burn in federal wilderness. That's changed. It's still difficult. But the idea was let nature take its course. Don't burn it, even though the flow of fire, the natural flow through the landscape, has been entirely cut off. At that time, I came back 10 years later, and that's the photo you see below. You can see the wilderness sign there. You can see the changes. There's a woody midstory starting to build up already. This is a fairly fertile soil. Where's the wiregrass? You see a layer of shrubs and deep pine needle layers. I went back last summer and resampled this site. Here's the center line right there. In 1984, under a natural fire regime, 3 years was very appropriate for this site based on the landscape. There were 54 grasses in Forbes. Last year, there were only 12. And the 12 there were just sprigs. What had wiregrass as one of the dominants on the site 34 years ago, I can now find only 2 sprigs, little sprigs of wiregrass. I did 24 square meter subplots in all of my original plots. And the mean herb cover in those was 88% under a natural fire regime. Today it's 3.6%. This is total transformation of a community. Once those longleaf are harvested, it's going to be replaced by hardwoods primarily. So what's the disturbance? The 3-year fire regime or the fire exclusion? Talk a little bit about some prospects coming out of all of this for Native Americans and the tribes. This is a photo of Lena Waters, a Yakima Indian woman, drying huckleberries against a big burning log, slow drying them in 1936. Coincidentally, well, in that area, the burn bosses for burning the huckleberry beds were usually elder women. They would know the fire regimes. They would watch, pick the time when it's been, say, 5 years since the last fire, the beds need to be burned again, and pick a good day to do it. In 1931, 5 years before this photo, the last Indian woman in California was arrested for doing a prescribed burn on her own. This slide, to me, is probably the most important message I have here for the people managing tribal lands across the country. The first people of North America could possibly shape the United States' response to global warming and mass extinction and the need for restoration. It's stopping a runaway train with burning fossil fuel. It's not going to happen quickly. It's not going to happen in the next 2 years, but there is going to be legislation and new funding coming back into conservation 3 to 5 years from now. There are too many pressures building for that. Native Americans, as the original keepers of the land, have a certain moral authority for directing this discussion, and that's recognized by a lot of people across the country. They respect opinions of Native Americans. The tribal voice needs to be unified. There need to be more meetings like this, and the fact that last year's meeting was 350 people and this year's meeting is only about 225 is due to federal restrictions on travel. Entirely unjustified based on the national budget. It's strictly aimed at fulfilling their effort to kill conservation funding in all of its different categories. That cannot continue. That is going to change. Tribes could begin now to position themselves for a share of the new funding that is going to come back. We have like less than a third of the funding we had 30 years ago for natural resources. So something to think about is how you can begin to come up with proposals that would address these issues of global warming and mass extinction, using fire and other methods to preserve species diversity of all birds, plants, and animals on the land. And you can do that while harvesting timber by having certain areas that you can burn and restore natural processes fully. There's such a cultural difference. I'm only now becoming aware of it, but these are some of the stories. The digging into their past, reconstruction of language, myths and stories and tales about animals, birds, plants, and animals and their relationship to the land is no longer just a pastime for learning about the past. It's actually going to be critical for guiding a change about how people across the country respond to nature and value it and protect it. I like some of these images. The Seminoles have a story about rabbit bringing fire to the people from another tribe that was hoarding it all to themselves. It took rabbit 4 or 5 tries before it actually finally managed to get away with a burning brand and bring it to the other people. This is Monty Dollock's painting of Stealing Fire by Woodpecker. And in much of the West, coyote plays a role. The painting on the right is by Richard Hook. He's dead now. Painted this maybe 30 years ago of coyotes stealing fire from the skookums. And I know Frank Tripp is here. I'm going to ask him if he knows this legend. But these were a mythical people that withheld fire from the people, and Coyote risked his life to bring it to people. The image in all of these tales is of the land providing gifts to humans. Then we should be grateful for that. And animals is positive. People as ourselves, the animal people, bring us gifts. It's so different from the European tradition, We see coyotes as something that needs to be exterminated, killed, poisoned, whatever it takes, because we don't want them to eat one of our sheep or a calf or something like that. And we've got to turn that image around. This really gonged in my head about 2 years ago. I was sitting on a ridge overlooking a grassy alpine valley on the Lost Trail Refuge that I was mapping for Fish and Wildlife Service, and realizing I was sitting in some grass. It was pine grass, and thinking, even this grass is some man's property. He wants it to feed his cattle, and he wants the trees to make money from them. And it was just, you would think I would have gotten it sooner than that. But somehow I really got it in that moment sitting there about the difference between property and the original land occupied by Native Americans, where animals were their own property and lands were their own property. So finally, I want to point out that fire is a broad conditioning agent. There is no surrogate for fire for maintaining habitats and sustaining the web of life. Nothing else even comes close. Nothing we can do, no amount of brush cutting, skid steer mulching, grazing by herds of cattle and goats is going to have anything related to what fire does in every ecosystem in the country, starting from fungal hyphae that feed the trees, bring in nutrients, connect trees to each other to make whole stands more sustainable, millions of microorganisms in every gram of soil, many of which are probably dependent on fire to maintain soil chemistry for their species. Summarizing forces that are going to be pushing the pendulum and already are. Climate change is real and we are causing it. This was the report to President Trump in 2017 in the fall. The conclusion of 13 agencies, all of the major agencies dealing with natural resources. The amazing thing was he didn't suppress the report. That was widely expected. That's an indication of the lid coming off. The sixth extinction is real, and we, the most weedy species ever to inhabit the earth, are causing it. We can live in any environment. We can eat anything organic if we work on it a little bit. And this is for the UN report that's in progress. It's not out yet. It'll be out this year. These are two major crises threatening life on Earth. There's going to be an increasing demand that's already happening for restoration of ecological integrity, including fire integrity. Our mission of restoring fire with the next swing of the pendulum is the most important work the human race has ever faced in our 3 million years on the planet, starting with Homo erectus that long ago. The web of life and the fate of more than half the terrestrial species on Earth depend on our success. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Frost. We have some time for some questions. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Frost on that truly fascinating speech.
Anybody? My email is the same as my name, cecil.frost@earthlink.net. If you have any comments or information or want to discuss any of this, I'm perfectly happy to talk to you by phone or email. So thanks very much.